Okay, so the title of this talk tonight is Making Pure Lands. Making Pure Lands. Before I start, just a very warm welcome, especially to anyone who hasn't been here on Tuesday nights before. If you haven't been here on Tuesday nights before, I'll just fill you in about the sort of overall structure of what we're doing. We've been following a theme, an overarching theme on great Buddhist texts. So we've been looking at some great Buddhist texts, not out of academic interest or historical interest, but really looking what they can tell us about how we live, how we can live better, how we can practice the Dharma in our lives. And the first part of that look at great Buddhist texts, we looked at some of the earliest things that were written down, the earliest of the Buddhist teachings that were written down in the Pali language from the Pali Canon. And we called that Thus Have I Heard, because they were passed down as an oral tradition for hundreds of years, these texts. These teachings of the Buddha, they were passed down as an oral tradition for hundreds of years. So when somebody repeated what the Buddha had said, they would start by saying, "Thus have I heard. This is what I've heard." So that was the first part of our sort of overarching theme. But we started a new part 3 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? 2 weeks ago, we heard how maybe 500, 600, very-ish, something like that, years after the Buddha's passing, a new movement seems to have arisen within Buddhism. Partly, judging from the great texts that it produced over the next few hundred years, partly as an attempt to re-emphasize the fact that Buddhism needs to be practiced not just to become happier and more liberated from negative states oneself, but also for the benefit of others. In the words the Buddha often used himself, for the welfare of the world, for the welfare of the many. And that's the title of this next series, if you like, for the welfare of the world, because we'll be looking at some of these great texts that were produced by a style of Buddhism, or a movement within Buddhism, which called itself the Mahayana. Maha means great, yana means vehicle or way, so the great vehicle, the great way. And we also saw 2 weeks ago that perhaps the defining thing about the Mahayana, the great way, is what has come to be called the Bodhisattva ideal. Bodhisattva. Bodhi means awakening, wisdom, enlightened wisdom. Sattva means being. So it doesn't communicate very much, does it? Sort of awakening being, awakened being. But a bodhisattva is the ideal of the bodhisattva is the ideal of a Buddhist who is practicing not just for their own sake, but for the sake of all. Somebody who is practicing for the welfare of the world, in order not just to stop being part of the problem, but to become part of the solution. Not aiming just to become more enlightened themselves, but actually aiming for the enlightenment of everybody, aiming to help the evolution of consciousness on this planet, helping to create a more enlightened world, a more enlightened society. And I think you could see this bodhisattva ideal. I mean, it really is a logical conclusion of the fact that we're told for an enlightened being the distinction between self and other is unreal. So if the distinction between self and other is unreal, the distinction between practicing the Dharma for oneself and for others becomes unreal. Of course one would practice for everybody because one would be completely pervaded by this sense of our connectedness with one another, our solidarity with one another. So someone who wants to move in the direction of enlightenment needs to be practicing in that way, in the same way, increasingly practicing more and more selflessly, more and more for others and not just for oneself. Going beyond selfishness. And this even includes going beyond selfishness in wanting enlightenment just for me, just for personal happiness. So, before I... sorry, I got my notes mixed up, wrong way around. So I introduced the Bodhisattva idea 2 weeks ago. And last week, Bodhinaga introduced a text from the Mahayana, which really brings in the Bodhisattva ideal, how we can practice the Bodhisattva ideal in just all the situations of an ordinary everyday life, called the 7-point mind training. So that's what we looked at last week. But this week, I'd like to look at some Mahayana texts, or at least bring in some Mahayana texts that give us a way of looking at the Bodhisattva ideal that is very, very important in our movement, very, very important in our order, very, very important in the Triratna and our Buddhist community. Because it gives us a vision of what our practice is about that is very, very suited to us and our needs in our society, simply because it's so, so necessary if we're going to get anywhere. So these texts that we're going to sort of at least mention, talk about, they relate to what's called the Pure Land. The Pure Land. The Pure Land, the Buddha Land, the Buddha Field, they're all synonymous. So I'm going to talk about Pure Lands, and I'm going to talk about how those relate to the Bodhisattva ideal and how those really relate to our practice here and now, how it's not just some funny thing that Buddhists came up with thousands of years ago. But before I do that, I really need to just give us a bit of background, okay? So where does this come from, this idea of Pure Land? What does it mean? How did the idea develop? Well, if you were here for the last series on the Pali Canon, you'll remember that even in the earliest Buddhist texts, the Buddha taught a practice called the mindfulness of the Buddha. He taught people to meditate, to call to mind, meditate on an enlightened being and an enlightened being's qualities, himself and his qualities. Calling those qualities into our own mind, if you like. When we imagine something, we experience it. So we call those qualities, at least an echo of them, into our mind as a way of developing those qualities ourselves. And that was a really important practice, has been an important practice even from the time of the Buddha. And over time, after the Buddha's passing, this practice evolved because a host of archetypal figures evolved within the Buddhist community that embodied particular aspects of enlightenment. So we got so this idea of meditating on the Buddha became meditating on a whole variety of enlightened figures. So, for example, we have Amitabha. You might have seen some of these figures on the intermediate course if you were there. For example, Amitabha, the red Buddha. The red, warm Buddha embodying the warm, emotional heart aspect of enlightenment, Amitabha, infinite light. The cool blue Buddha, Kshobhya, the unshakable, who embodies a sort of cool, clear wisdom of enlightenment, the wisdom aspect. And people would connect with these visionary figures in meditation. In their heightened imagination, in meditation, as a way of allowing some of the qualities of these that the Buddha represents to flow into their mind, to perfume their mind, to colour their mind by meditating on these figures. So we have this evolution of a range of different Buddha figures and Bodhisattva figures that people would develop a close connection with and meditate on. So that's one thing that happened. And the second thing that happened was we also see the idea emerging that a Buddha, an enlightened being, creates a sort of sphere of influence around themselves. They create a sort of force field around themselves, which is called a Buddha field, or a Pure Land, or a Buddha Land. And if we think about our experience, I think we can see that idea is not at all surprising, because we probably know people who you go into their sort of world, if you like, if you get close to them and you experience their sort of field. Some people's field is lovely to be in. Imran Banks's field is lovely to be in. Imran Banks's field. He creates a field around himself by his positive qualities, which influences those who come into contact with him. Other people create the opposite. And it's really not all that pleasant to be in their company. It's quite negative, it's quite jarring, whatever. So we all create a sort of sphere of influence around ourselves, a force field around ourselves. Positive or negative. Good to be around, not good to be around. Helping us to grow, not helping us to grow. And because an enlightened being, so we all do that, but an enlightened being has broken out of the limitations we experience. They've tapped into the nature of reality. They've connected themselves with the nature of reality. So they've developed this tremendous spiritual power. They can create such a sphere of influence in spades. They can create such a sphere of influence on a grand scale. They can create a wonderful, pure land around themselves by their influence. A place of great beauty where everything shines with light. That's how it's traditionally seen. Everything is made of jewels, where the wind and the leaves make beautiful music, where the air and the water, just a touch of them gives delight and bliss. It's just an attempt to convey the maximum happiness, a wonderful environment. And people who have a strong connection with that Buddha, traditionally, it's seen that they can actually live in this sphere of influence. They can actually live in this pure land. So it has to be said that in most schools of Buddhism, most schools of Pure Land Buddhism, it was taught that people with that sort of connection would be reborn in the Buddha's Pure Land after death. But we also get maybe a more sophisticated take on this, that the Pure Land actually represents the enlightened state. It actually represents what it's like to be enlightened. And that people can live in the Pure Land right here and now. It doesn't have to be a place you go to, another dimension you sort of go to. The Pure Land, like a heaven, the Pure Land is a state of mind, a state of heart, a state of being. And as such, the Pure Land, I think, can be a very, very vivid symbol of enlightenment. Perhaps a better symbol of enlightenment than the seated Buddha, the solitary seated Buddha, because the Pure Land, the symbol of the Pure Land shows us, in a way, it tries to get at what it would be like to be enlightened. That's what our experience would be. We'd be living in the Pure Land, this wonderful place. And a Pure Land is somewhere that you live in community with others. It's somewhere that's shared. So it brings in a whole other dimension compared to the seated Buddha as an image of enlightenment, which could give the impression that enlightenment is a sort of ivory tower state of isolation. So as I say, that might be a more sophisticated take. In China and Japan particularly, Pure Land Buddhism developed into a very highly devotional, faith-based style of practice that became extremely popular and still is. I'll hazard a wild guess. I think it's not a guess, but the great majority of Buddhists in Japan, for example, are Pure Land Buddhists, I believe. They practice in this style. And this sort of, these particularly Chinese and Japanese Pure Land schools were based on two texts principally, that concern a particular Buddha, the Buddha Amitabha. So the Buddha Amitabha was said to the Buddha of infinite light, the warm, sort of emotional red Buddha, or golden Buddha as he's sometimes seen, creates the Pure Land of Sukhavati, which means the happy land. He creates the Pure Land of Sukhavati. And in these texts, the Sukhavati Sutras, Amitabha, before he's enlightened, promises, this is simplifying enormously, but he basically promises that anybody who calls upon him will be reborn in his Pure Land. Sukhavati, the happy land, where developing and becoming enlightened will just be child's play. like falling off a log. And that seems to have been, that's definitely the sort of most popular idea of a pure land, a Buddha land. So traditionally a Buddha land was literally seen as a world or a land that a highly developed being like a Buddha created around themselves by their positive energies and qualities. Almost in a different dimension, we could say, outside this world, sort of virtual world. You could bubble off this world you could go into, or it's in another world system. A world of beauty and nobility and warmth and light, a world that made it easy for others to grow and develop and blossom, in which people could literally live and be nurtured and influenced. So that's a sort of mythic view of the Buddha land. But there is one very, very influential Buddhist scripture that talks about the pure land, the Buddha land, in quite a different way, and in a way that's had, I think, a tremendous influence on us in Triratna. And that is a text called, well, in the translation that I've got, it's called The Holy Teaching of Vimalakirti. Vimalakirti. Vimalakirti is a lay person, and it's a very influential and very funny Mahayana text, actually. I don't actually recommend sort of getting it out and trying to read it from cover to cover. If you get a chance to study the Vimalakirti Nirdesha Sutra, do. It is actually, in places, a hoot. It is actually, in places, really annoying. And it is, in places, just completely puzzling. But it does have this take on... So I'd like to just talk about the bit that it talks about pure lands, what it says about the pure land. So the Vimalakirti Sutra talks about a Buddha field or a pure land as about being a field of sentient beings. A field of sentient beings created by the beings within it, by their positive thought, by their generosity, by their aspiration towards enlightenment, by their metta, created by their compassion, created by their ethical actions, created by their communication with one another. So according to the Vimalakirti Sutra, a bodhisattva establishes, and what a bodhisattva does, the way a bodhisattva practices, is what a bodhisattva does is to establish a Buddha field. Not by creating a world that exists in another dimension, but by gathering a community, teaching that community to practice the Dharma, teaching that community to cultivate higher states, to live ethically, to bring out the best in each other, so that together they create a pure land, a Buddha field. So this sort of pure land does not exist in another dimension. It is a world that exists in the midst of this world, a world that is created by a group of spiritual practitioners, when a spiritual practitioner attracts other people, and a community is created where the same values and ethics create this positive community, where metta and harmony and peace and commitment to positive values are like the air that people breathe, rather than being the exception. So that's a rather different concept of a Buddha field or a pure land. And this concept of the Buddha land or the Buddha field or the pure land has a lot to do with the way we interpret the Bodhisattva ideal and the way we practice, the way we try to practice the Bodhisattva ideal in Triratna, in the order and in the community. It has a lot to do with our whole approach, actually, our whole approach to Buddhism. Because according to our founder, according to Sangha, although the Bodhisattva ideal is hugely important to our movement and our order, which it is, it's really central to our order and movement, but it's really unrealistic to think of ourselves as bodhisattvas. It's hubristic. Good word. It's hubristic to think of ourselves as individuals, as bodhisattvas. We could never be what the Bodhisattva ideal describes. The Bodhisattva vows to save all beings. I mean, give over. I mean, you know, vowing to save all beings. I mean, well, yeah, what does that include? Slugs? I say to us gardeners. Bodhisattva vows to save all beings. A bodhisattva, we can't imagine that. We can't get our heads around that. I mean, a bodhisattva cares more for others than they care for themselves, and we don't do that. I'm sorry, we don't. We don't give away all our possessions to sentient beings, etc., etc. We can't do it. The bodhisattva idea applied to an individual is unrealistic. So according to Sangha, while the bodhisattva idea is central to our movement, we shouldn't think of ourselves as individuals, as bodhisattvas. We shouldn't think, oh, I'm a bodhisattva. I'm told that in certain schools of Eastern Buddhism, you can get a certificate that you can put on your wall that says you're a bodhisattva. Well, we don't go there, okay? That's just not going to work, really. Rather, we should think of ourselves as coming together with others to create a community through which the bodhisattva spirit can manifest. We come together with others, we could say thinking mythically and poetically, to create a bodhisattva which is bigger than any of us, of which we are all part. We could think of our centre, we could think of our Sangha. We certainly try to think of our order as a bodhisattva, that we can be part of creating and that we can play a part in manifesting the bodhisattva activity of. So each of us can be an aspect of a bodhisattva. We can each play our part in creating the bodhisattva, which means creating the Sangha, and we can each play our part in the bodhisattva activity of that larger bodhisattva. And that image is very much... So the image that really captures that, I think, is the image of the Thousand-Armed Avalokiteshvara. Those of you who were on our weekend retreat will have seen an image where there's a very strange-looking being, to be frank, who is holding a jewel to his heart. That jewel is, if you like, the bodhisattva spirit. And then there are 1,000 arms. I haven't counted them, but there's supposed to be 1,000 arms around. Each being an individual hasn't sacrificed their individuality, but they're each responding to this bodhisattva spirit, offering their particular gift to the world. And that is very much an image of the sort of bodhisattva we're seeking to create, which is transpersonal, which is bigger than any individual, because to think of oneself as a bodhisattva just isn't going to work. So Sangha vision of a Buddhist centre, like this one, which he talks about in his commentary to the Vimalakirti Nidesha Sutra, is that we order members, what we should be doing when we try to create a centre like this one, is coming together to attract a community and to teach and inspire people in that community, so that together we create a mini Pure Land, so that together we create a bodhisattva. The two are synonymous. We create a mini Pure Land by our positive thought, by our metta, by our compassion, by our ethics, our shared ethics, by our meditation, by our communication with one another, by the fact that the way we relate to one another brings out the best in each other, causes us to grow rather than sort of pushing us down to a lower level. So we create, when a group of order members seek to establish a Buddhist centre, what we're trying to do is come together to create a mini Pure Land, to attract a community, create a mini Pure Land in which we can all develop and grow towards enlightenment. Because without such an environment, none of us will be capable of growing towards enlightenment. You might remember from the introductory course, the last week of the introductory course, we talk about how we are not separate individuals. We are not independent. The idea of the independent fixed self is fallacious. We are hugely connected to others. We are hugely dependent. And one implication of that is we're not going to make progress unless we're in a situation, part of a community which allows us to make progress. So for us, the idea of the Pure Land and the idea of the Bodhisattva both relate to the Sangha. They both relate to the Sangha that we need to create between us, among us, the sort of spiritual community we're trying to create at this Buddhist centre, the sort of positive environment we need to create if any of us are going to get very far. We want to create a mini Pure Land, and we want to create a Bodhisattva and a focus for Bodhisattva activity that we can all be part of. Okay. If you haven't been coming to this centre for very long, and you haven't yet really connected yet much of a connection with the Sangha, that could all seem a bit grand. But you could also see the Buddha field, if you like. You could see creating a Buddhist field as the sphere of influence that each of us has, and that each of us could have if we practice the Dharma to any real extent. A Buddha may create a huge and beautiful Buddha land. A spiritual community may create a smaller and less perfect version that needs hoovering and things like that. But still affects many, many people. But if we each practice metta and calm and positivity as we go about our day and our business, we will each create a mini Buddha land around us in our ordinary lives. We'll create a positive sphere of influence which will affect people. The people we're close to, it will create a more positive atmosphere in our families, among our friends, and in our workplace. People who are receptive will sit up and take notice. They will get interested in what makes us different. So yeah, as I've said a bit, in the 6th week of the introductory course, we talk about the Buddhist idea of anatman, non-self. The fact that we don't exist as isolated, independent beings. We saw we can't really be separated from the world around us. The people around us, we're highly influenced by the environment we find ourselves in, the people we spend time with, the society that surrounds us. And we in turn influence the world around us. We help to create the world around us. We help to influence other people around us. We create our world, the world creates us. We can't separate the two. So to grow, we need to work on ourselves. Of course we do. We need to work on ourselves. But we also need to work on the conditions that surround us. We need to change the world. As we change, we will change the world. As we change the world, we'll be able to change ourselves more and more. We can't move towards enlightenment as separate individuals unless we also create a more enlightened community around ourselves. We can't create a more enlightened community around ourselves unless we become more enlightened individuals. We have to do both together. Two go together, they can't be separated. And probably our natural tendency, especially in our society, is to think about me. How can I work on me to become happier and more emotionally healthy? And for that reason, I think we need to just keep really emphasising and remembering that we also need to think about how we influence the world around us, the effect we have on the world around us, the people around us. That has to be part of our motivation for practice, because we do create the world we live in by the way we act and speak, and then we have to live in that world. We have to live in the world that we have created, for better or worse, and it will have a powerful influence on us. So we all need to see this idea of building a Buddha land or creating a sphere of influence as part of our practice. We all need to think about how we influence and affect others, the force field we create around ourselves, hopefully the positive sphere of influence we create around ourselves. And we may see this as creating a more positive atmosphere in our private lives, if you like, among our family and friends and colleagues. But I really hope you will be inspired to set your sights higher than that, actually. I really hope you will be inspired to join us in seeing an important part of your practice of Buddhism as being about creating a Sangha, creating a community, creating a mini Pure Land among us. A more enlightened community within which we can all grow and become more enlightened beings, and which can have an effect on the wider world around us, which can engage in bodhisattva activity. Because coming together, we can achieve far more than we can achieve apart. If you want to have an impact on the world, forget about doing it on your own. It just ain't going to work. But come together with others and we can have a real impact on the world. So, creating a Sangha, this is nothing to do with the talk, I'm just going to say it because I like the image. Creating a Sangha is like creating a bonfire with damp wood, okay? You keep the bits of wood separate, and all they do is smoke, smoulder, and go out. Doesn't matter how much you try and light them. But put the wood together with the hottest bits in the middle, and something new happens. With any luck, the whole lot bursts into flame, giving off much more heat and light, and even drying out the really soggy wood, which is towards the edges, the spiritually soggy wood towards the edges. Even that will be affected. And they will catch fire, and we all start soggy. So we should be really, really grateful to the few people who piled themselves together to start creating the fire that eventually dried us out so we could be piled onto the bonfire. So we need to create a community. We need to create a community. We need to build the Buddha land, big or small. How do we go about doing that? How do we go about doing that? Well, luckily, this being Buddhism, there is a list. So, the list. And the list is called the Samgrahavastus. The Samgrahavastus, the means of unification. And there's a bit of a story about this list. It's actually in the Pali Canon, although it's very, very important in Mahayana Buddhism because this whole idea of building the Buddha land is so important. This whole idea of Sangha is so important in Mahayana, but it's there in the Pali Canon in the older strata of teachings. And the story concerns a disciple called Hataka. And Hataka practices with the Buddha. And then he goes back to his homeland. He goes back to his homeland and teaches the Dharma. Which is very much what the Buddha encouraged people to do, not to focus just on themselves, but to pass it on. Anyway, Hataka goes back to his homeland and he starts teaching the Dharma. And he gets on with it, and he gets on with it, and he gets on with it. He gathers a community. And then years and years later, the Buddha in his wanderings comes back and visits the village, the town where Hataka lives. And what he finds is that Hataka's got this huge Sangha. There's this huge Sangha. And crowds of people of all sorts come to meditate with Hataka, to hear him talk about the Dharma, to discuss the Dharma, or just to be with people who are practicing the Dharma. And the Buddha is delighted, and he said, "Well done, Hataka, well done. How did you do it? You know, all on your own. How did you gather such a big community of people? This following of yours, Hataka, is very large. How did you gather it, and how do you keep it united?" And Hataka replies, "My teacher, it is by the four means of unification, the Samgrahavastus, which you taught me, that I keep them united. When I can make a connection with someone through generosity, I use generosity. When I can make a connection with someone through kind speech, I use kind speech. When I can make a connection with someone through beneficial activity, I use beneficial activity. When I know that I can make a connection with someone through exemplification or empathy, I use that." When I say, "Sadhu, Hataka, sadhu," that is just the way to attract and unify a large following. So, yes, well done. Well done, Hataka. So, Hataka practices the Samgrahavastus and attracts a large and unifies a large community. So, what are the Samgrahavastus, and how do we do it? Well, the first one is dana, generosity. Generosity is the economics of the Buddha land. We need to get away from market economics. The idea that I'll give you this if you give me that. A real community does not operate on that basis. A real community operates on the basis that people contribute what they can and they take what they need. I'll give you this only if you give me that is based on fundamental egotism and separation between people. So in a community, people relate to each other based on a desire to make a contribution. Different people make their contributions in different ways. And this is why we have a dana economy in this centre. I mean, we're about practicing the Sangha Vastus to build a community. How could we not have a dana economy, an economy in which what we provide is free? Do you charge people to be part of your community? No. A community is a group of people who are united in a common project. So we need, if we're going to build a community by the Sangha Vastus, we've got to start with dana, haven't we? We've got to start with us being generous, take the risk. Oh, we're not going to charge for anything and we'll see if we go broke. And what happens is that we create a community which is characterised by generosity, as this community is very largely characterised by generosity, with loads of volunteer effort and lots and lots of, frankly, money coming in from people who, enough, coming in from people who actually have some money. Different people contributing in different ways. And it's a chain reaction. Generosity breeds generosity. Stinginess breeds stinginess. So if we wanted a stingy community, we could have started by charging really high prices. But generosity also works at the level of interaction between us, personal relationships, giving gifts, even small gifts, cards, whatever, creates bonds of friendship, and that's what a community is about. Giving time, giving interest, being part of each other's lives, that's all generosity. We live in this highly individualistic world where, if we're not careful, we each keep ourselves to ourselves, we relate to each other often in very limited ways. And that is not a good way for human beings to be. I mean, creating a spiritual community, creating a pure land, if you like, these are lovely mythic ideas, but just community. Where do they exist in our society? Don't we have a need for communities? So it's not a good way to be happy, to be in this sort of highly individualistic mode of being. So let's be subversive. Let's undermine the consumer society. Let's be really subversive and break out of our little nuclear setup and create something bigger. Dana, subversive practice. Giving something for nothing? It's got to be against a law. I'm sure there's a law against it, because, if everybody did it, where would we be? Companies wouldn't make any profits. It would be terrible. Anyway. Secondly, priyavadita, kindly speech. Kindly speech. Priya means dear, pleasant. Speaking as we would to someone who is dear to us, which means speaking pleasant. Dear means important as well, speaking to somebody as though they were important to us. Not just nice, but as to someone who is dear, as to someone who is important to us, who we really love. It includes encouraging, it includes praising, appreciating, thanking. It includes apologising, because we will probably be unskillful sometimes. And it has an incredibly powerful effect on people. Most talk is a bit stingy. It keeps people in their place. We don't want to overpraise people in case they get big-headed. We perhaps see ourselves as in a sort of competitive relationship with people where if we make them too good, it makes us look bad or something. A bit hungry and thin. So it keeps people a bit starved for praise and appreciation, a bit hungry and thin. And praising and appreciating people is like sunshine. It can make them blossom and grow. And again, there's a chain reaction. The more we speak kindly of each other, the more we want to do it, the more safe it is to do it, the more we can acknowledge and appreciate others. So there's a quote from the Pali Canon which describes the real practitioner as a uniter of the divided, a promoter of friendships. Harmony is their delight. They exult in harmony. They are passionately fond of harmony. They become a speaker of words that promote concord. So that's the sort of idea that we're getting at. On the negative side, priyavadita obviously means avoiding harsh speech, words that are rough, hard, hurtful, offensive to others. And also the Pali Canon, particularly when it talks about this, singles out gossip, repeating elsewhere what is heard here for the purpose of creating division. So, yeah, isn't that such a feature of some not so great communities, is that idea of gossip. So, repeating elsewhere what is heard. Have you heard what she said? Have you heard what she said? I mean, and it's really, so it's quite common in communities, I think, and it's very, very divisive. So we aim for speech that encourages, creates a positive atmosphere, unites. Thirdly, artacharya. Artacharya means something like beneficial activity, helping. In a spiritual community, people help each other. Friends help each other. And the best way to cultivate a friend is to help the person. It can be practical, with practical needs, helping people move house, do tasks, babysitting, whatever. That creates mutual bonds of friendship, creates community. Traditionally, though, artacharya has been seen as the sort of ultimate artacharya is to teach the Dharma, to pass on a spiritual vision, to teach people how to live well. That's the best way, apparently, if we can do it effectively with deep enough spiritual vision. But we certainly don't want to be going around giving folk lectures on Buddhism. That's not the way to make friends, I don't think. And lastly, samanata, or samanata. I'm never quite sure about this. Is it samanata or samanatata? Samanatata, that's what I thought. It's often translated as sam is the same root as our same. It sort of means sameness, literally translated, I think, sameness. Often translated as exemplification, walking our talk. So better than 100 Dharma talks is someone who lives and acts according to the Dharma. In terms of teaching people the Dharma, especially people who aren't Buddhists, being an example of the Dharma in practice is often the only way to get through, also the best. There is another translation, though, so it could be exemplification. We need to walk our talk. If we're going to be a community based on the Dharma, we need to practice the Dharma. But there's another translation, which is, again, based on this idea of sameness, which is treating others as oneself. Treating others as oneself, sort of not distinguishing. To really do that would be a very high aspiration. Requiring that we've really gone beyond our egocentricity. But at our level, I mean, just realising that there is a sense in which we're all equal. We've all got lots of flaws and defects. We see that in others really easily, don't we? But just recognising that I'm the same. I've also got flaws and defects, so that we don't get into criticism, we don't get into blaming, etc. We make allowances. We forgive. We don't moan and criticise. We let the lapses go and relate to what is best in people. Don't dwell on the negative, focus on the positive. And in this way, we bring out the positive more and more. So those are the four Sangha, the means of unification. We use them to create a Sangha. We could use them to relate to friends and create and nurture friendly relationships. And building Sangha by practicing the Sangha, creating a community, gathering a community by practicing the Sangha is the ethos of this centre. It's what this centre is built on. It's the model that we try to make guide everything we do. We are trying to create a spiritual community in which we can all grow and flourish by practicing generosity, by practicing kindly speech, helpful action, mutual support, walking our talk. Trying to overcome our narrow self-concern, caring as much, if we can, for others as we do for ourselves. And I mean, for order members, that building Sangha, that creating the Pure Land, is an important part of our practice. And that's a very traditional way of seeing things. The ideal spiritual practitioner, according to Mahayana Buddhism, makes it their practice to attract and unify a community around themselves. where people are mutually inspired, in which we all grow and develop. They create a little Buddha land around themselves. So yeah, we try and come together with others to build a Buddha land, to create a spiritual community, to create something we could not have done on our own as flawed individuals. Somehow, the rather motley crew of order members that have been involved in this centre have actually brought something quite good into existence, which none of us could have got anywhere near on our own. So, building the Buddha land and we don't see building the Buddha land and pursuing our own development as two separate activities. They're two sides of the same coin. I remember being asked, doesn't all the work you do at the centre get in the way of your practice? I was like, ugh. The work I do at the centre is a really important part of my practice. One of the most powerful ways to move forward as individuals is to make it a practice to try and have a positive effect on those around us. And in the same way, that's the most effective way to make the world a better place is to develop and manifest our own spiritual potential. We need to do it together. So building a Buddha land by practicing the Sangha and Vastas, part of our Buddhist practice, got to be part of our Buddhist practice, I hope, for all of us. We all create a world around ourselves, for better or worse, and then we live in that world, even if it's unpleasant. And what I would hope is that you would be inspired to join us in practicing the Sangha Vastus to create a mini Pure Land here, really to create a better world around us, to create a mini Pure Land from which we can go out and have a real positive effect on the world. Thank you.